From Occupation to Occupy, Anti-Semitism in the Contemporary Left in the United States by Sina Arnold. I think that's how you pronounce it. It looks like Sina Arnold in English, but I think she's German, so it's Sina Arnold. The contemporary political left has often been described as one of the central actors of the new anti-Semitism in the United States. So far, however, little empirical research has been conducted to analyze this specific political milieu. Writing on the topic often focuses on the German context, but works looking at the history of the U.S. left's uneasy relationship to anti-Semitism are few and far between. This lack of attention is surprising, since the current economic crisis has been met by various popular responses in the United States, including the emergence of the left-wing Occupy Wall Street movement. Crises, however, are often times when anti-Semitic ideologies resurface, so the question of the relationship between anti-Semitism and the left becomes even more relevant. Moreover, the success of the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement and the proliferation of pro-Palestinian groups opposing the Israeli occupation, particularly on college campuses, have in recent years renewed questions as to the fine line between critiques of Israel and anti-Semitism. This chapter addresses this issue by analyzing contemporary left social movements in the United States. Excuse me. This chapter addresses this issue by analyzing contemporary left social movements in the United States. Based on qualitative interviews with political activists, it points to central characteristics of left anti-Semitism discourse, examines the main frames in these debates, and offers explanations for these positions. Finally, it draws methodological and theoretical conclusions regarding the nature of the new anti-Semitism. Its empirical sources are 30 qualitative interviews with Jewish and non-Jewish activists, expert interviews conducted mostly with members of New York Jewish organizations, analysis of current movements literature, as well as participant observation at Occupy Wall Street protest sites and other political events. Employing an anthropological approach, the chapter is also an attempt at a, quote, thick description of the negotiation of anti-Semitism in everyday settings. The focus on the interviews is twofold. First, interviews explore what anti-Semitic topoi can be found among present-day left actors, which ones are most common, and how they are contextualized. Second, the interviews show activist perspectives on anti-Semitism. How is anti-Semitism conceptualized? Is it considered a relevant problem? These issues are subsumed under the label of anti-Semitism discourses, meaning both anti-Semitic speech and speech about anti-Semitism. While the chapter takes contemporary left social movements in the United States as a case study, on a theoretical level, it attempts to go beyond a descriptive approach by proposing a framework for analyzing anti-Semitic attitudes, as well as attitudes towards anti-Semitism on the political left. It sees left debates and their strategic outcomes as informed by international theoretical debates, but also framed within a national setting. Rather than merely analyzing individual stereotypes, it explores which ideological and social factors support or hinder the emergence of anti-Semitic attitudes on the left. That is, it uncovers the, quote, enabling conditions of anti-Semitism. The invisible prejudice. Central features of left anti-Semitism discourse. The dominant features of left anti-Semitism discourse can be summed up as follows. First, there are reoccurring instances of open anti-Semitism. These include, for example, a person at the New York Occupy Wall Street camp repeatedly holding signs like, quote, Google Jewish bankers, end quote, or someone verbally assaulting a visibly Jewish man at the same place, or anti-Semitic conspiracy theories in the Occupy Online forum. The protests against the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan regularly featured banners and posters with anti-Semitic imagery. Likewise, several anti-Israel protests in the following years featured anti-Semitic tropes. However, such instances of open Jew hatred are in fact fairly marginal. In the interviews, only one person expressed a consistently anti-Semitic worldview, while others occasionally reproduced single stereotypes mostly related to the image of disproportionate Jewish power in the economy and politics. Most forms of classical anti-Semitism, including ideas of dual loyalty, anti-Judaism, or stereotypical racial imagery, the process of, quote, turning Jews into the Jews, as Brian Klug put it, were absent. A second feature of left anti-Semitism discourse is that an anti-Zionist position, or at least a critical orientation toward Israel, is the norm within the spectrum of the left analyzed here, leading to a one-sided critique of Israel. While activists are often careful to distinguish between the categories Israel, Israelis, and Jews, nonetheless, a mono-perspective and Manichaean view of the Middle East conflict is dominant. Thus, 5 common double standards can be identified. The double standard of salience leads to a situation where the Middle East conflict receives vastly more attention than other international conflicts in left debates. The double standard of state foundation marks Israel's establishment as artificial and violent, in contrast to other states, which are presumed to be peacefully and, quote, organically grown. God blow my nose, I'm sorry. Yeah, I like that. Yeah, that organically thing. There's a certain, I don't know, certain left Volksgemeinschaft discourse that you come across from time to time that is questionable to say the least. Sorry, that was my comment, that last comment. Returning to the text, anyway. The double standard of state formation sees Israel as anachronistic. It is depicted as a colonial and imperial regime that pursues an archaic form of expansionism. The double standard of self-understanding translates into Israel being criticized as a specifically ethnic religious state, while also ignoring that this holds true for several other states that exist today. And finally, the double standard of self-determination results in acknowledging free choice of political means only for Palestinians. Their feelings of rage and despair are seen as legitimate, sometimes leading to rationalization and understanding of suicide bombings. There is also support for groups like Hamas, even when they may contradict personal political convictions, for example, nonviolence. In contrast, feelings of fear and insecurity among Jewish Israelis are not taken into account. Israel's militarization or political moves to the right are never interpreted in a similar way. Third, anti-Semitism is not perceived as a relevant issue in its own right. Interview partners did often mention instances of anti-Semitism that they themselves as Jews experienced or as non-Jews witnessed. However, on a list of isms to target, capitalism, racism, sexism, and so on, anti-Semitism was not However, on a list of isms to target, capitalism, racism, sexism, and so on, anti-Semitism usually was not worth mentioning at all. One interview partner was critical of this fact and remembers his own political socialization into the left. Quote, "As a person raised this way, I feel like the problem is no one talks about it. When I was coming into activism, you had to talk about race. You had to talk about these different things. You had to talk about gender. You had to criticize these things or people were going to call you out on it. So you have to really sit there and decompress and really read and understand where your power is and how that affects other people. And you never really do that. You never really understand how you are anti-Semitic or how you view Jewish people." End quote. As a consequence, anti-Semitism is considered, in the words of another interview partner, as, quote, "mostly a light-hearted thing," end quote. When directly asked, quote, "do you think that anti-Semitism is a problem in the United States today," end quote, the activist hardly spent time talking about anti-Semitism, examples, instances, observations, but instead actively redirected the conversation so as to talk about the problems they associate with this phenomenon, its supposedly strategic use or, quote, misuse, typically understood as providing justification for Israel. This avoidance or marginalization also holds true for dealing with historical anti-Semitism, namely the Holocaust. This phenomenon amounts to, quote, anti-Semitism trivialization, end quote. And its dynamics have already been pointed out both within intra-left debates and by outside critics. Ernest Folkman speaks of, quote, an anti-Semitism of indifference, end quote, within the New Left. Jewish feminist Irina Klepfis noted a, quote, anti-Semitism by omission, end quote, in the 1980s, and Arthur Liebman articulates the, quote, insensitivity thesis of left anti-Semitism, end quote. Robert Fine has called this mechanism, quote, anti-Semitism denial, meaning an active tendency towards downplaying or denying the importance of anti-Semitism, a refusal to take seriously the charge of anti-Semitism, the reflexive dissociation of the left in anti-Semitism, and a shift from talking about anti-Semitism to talking about accusations of anti-Semitism unjustly experienced as left activists. To quote one interview partner's answer to the aforementioned question, quote, "Well, the biggest problem with anti-Semitism is that it's used as a rallying cry for supporting the state of Israel and its horrors," end quote. In consequence, this attitude means that the banners of demonstrations mentioned earlier and other expressions of anti-Semitism in left settings are often tolerated. This stance is in stark contrast to how the left deals with other, quote, isms. Occupy Wall Street, to take a recent example, triggered lively debates about white privilege and racism within the movement, and also debated how to address the sexual assaults and male dominance that occurred in some encampments. Understanding themselves as members of a structurally racist and patriarchal society, activists often show a high degree of sensitivity and self-criticism in these areas. Attempts at addressing anti-Semitism in a similar fashion, however, generally fail and are answered with rejection and hostility. In some cases, this denial is so strong that it leads to mockery. For example, as expressed by philosophy professor Michael Neumann in The Politics of Anti-Semitism, edited by Cockburn and St. Clair, which is often the only publication on the subject to be found in left-wing bookstores in the United States. Quote, "I think we should almost never take anti-Semitism seriously, and maybe we should have some fun with it," end quote. Such mockery is accompanied by trivialization, as when Neumann writes, "Undoubtedly, quote, undoubtedly, there is genuine anti-Semitism in the Arab world. The distribution of the protocols of the elders of Zion, the myths about stealing the blood of Gentile babies. This is utterly inexcusable. So is your failure to answer Aunt B's last letter," end quote. 1 second. Hopefully that's a little quieter. No, unfortunately I don't live alone. I'd like to live in a cave. Isolated and by myself. So I can just record audio things. Anyway, let me reread that last sentence. Such mockery is accompanied by trivialization, as when Neumann writes, quote, "Undoubtedly there is genuine anti-Semitism in the Arab world. The distribution of the protocols of the elders of Zion, the myths about stealing the blood of Gentile babies. This is utterly inexcusable. So is your failure to answer Aunt B's last letter." End quote. His article is but one of many such examples, both in the activist and the intellectual left. The sociology of social problems has long noted that any given circumstance is not perceived as a problem because of objective factors, but rather because a process of social definition allows it to be perceived as a problem by movements and individuals. The trivialization of anti-Semitism, its non-perception as a problem, thus calls for an explanation. A fourth feature of left anti-Semitism discourse, and closely related to this matter, is a mechanism David Hirsch has called the Livingstone formulation, referring to former London Mayor Ken Livingstone. Is it pronounced Livingstone? It's Livingstone, but I think it might be pronounced. I think it's pronounced Livingston. Anyway, Ken Livingstone. It describes a common reaction to accusations of anti-Semitism, namely the reflexive defense against any such accusations and the knee-jerk, quote, counter-accusation that the person raising the issue of anti-Semitism is doing so in bad faith and dishonestly, in order to delegitimize criticism of Israel, end quote. This formulation revealed an interesting recurring dynamic in the interviews. When asked about anti-Semitism, instead of talking about the issue, interview partners redirected the conversation to talk about accusations of anti-Semitism and its alleged abuse. Granted, these accusations are not always imagined. Activists do sometimes experience denunciation as, quote, self-hating Jews or, quote, Nazis during demonstrations and events. They sometimes face critics who use overgeneralizing allegations. To take one example, in 2014, Tom Perkins, founder of venture capital firm Kleiner Perkins, Caulfield and Byers, suggested in a letter to the editor of the Wall Street Journal that the Occupy movement and the wider left's campaign against the rich 1% was comparable to National Socialist politics against the Jewish 1%. Perkins asked furthermore, Kristallnacht was, quote, he asked furthermore, quote, Kristallnacht was unthinkable in 1930. Is its descendant progressive radicalism unthinkable now? End quote. To take another, on November 3rd, 2011, during the emergence of the Occupy movement, 3 cars were torched in a Jewish neighborhood in Brooklyn with graffiti on or surrounding benches, including swastikas and KKK, pointing to an anti-Semitic motivation. A local newspaper affirmatively quoted a resident who assumed the arson might have been committed by participants of Occupy Wall Street, given the supposedly frequent examples of anti-Semitism there. However, such claims of rampant and overt Jew hatred within the left are far-fetched. More prevalent is that accusations of anti-Semitism are almost always perceived as strategically motivated. As described above, this judgment stands in contrast to the perception of accusations of sexism or racism, which are far more likely to be taken at face value and critically evaluated. Beyond the checklist, a 3-level analysis of anti-Semitism. Debates around anti-Semitism in the left in academia and the media often focus solely on the first of the aspects mentioned earlier, instances of open anti-Semitism. These debates are mostly characterized by simplified accusations. U.S. and Israel commentators have accused the Occupy movement of, quote, naked anti-Semitism, to quote Phyllis Kessler, or imagine a situation comparable to pre-World War II Germany as in an article in Israel Today. As these debates mostly revolve around the question of distinguishing between anti-Semitism and legitimate critiques of Israel, not surprisingly, accusations often take the form of a, quote, checklist approach. This approach analyzes a given statement by applying the quote, 3 Ds of anti-Semitism developed by Nathan Sharansky, asking whether there are demonetization, delegitimation, and double standards to be found. Oh, demonetization. Jesus Christ. So used to saying that word these days on YouTube that you mistake demonetization for demonization. So let me repeat that entire sentence. This approach analyzes a given statement by applying the, quote, 3 Ds of anti-Semitism, developed by Nathan Sharansky, asking whether there are demonization, delegitimation, and double standards to be found to determine if a statement and, in extension, a movement is anti-Semitic. Indeed, then, when following the 3 Ds of anti-Semitism, all 3 Ds can be found, as is shown above. Another tool for distinguishing between anti-Semitism and a critique of Israel is the internationally widely used, quote, working definition of anti-Semitism, adopted in 2005 by what was then the European Union Monitoring Center on Racism and Xenophobia. While the definition does list, quote, several examples of the ways in which anti-Semitism manifests itself with regard to the state of Israel, end quote, it adds that these have to be understood, quote, taking into account the overall context, end quote. This, however, is where the problem and thus the need for analysis arise. While both the 3 Ds and the EUMC's working definitions are useful tools for practical purposes, I suggest moving away from the checklist approach of analyzing left anti-Semitism to instead situate and contextualize an analysis against the backdrop of political cultural opportunity structures, national history, and collective identity. Therefore, an analysis of anti-Semitism in social movements must focus not only on potential anti-Semitic topoi, sorry. Where the hell was I? Therefore, an analysis of anti-Semitism in social movements must focus not only on potential anti-Semitic topoi, but in order to gain a deeper understanding, also on its enabling conditions. More concretely, a 3-level approach for an analysis of these enabling conditions of left anti-Semitism discourse is suggested. On the macro level, the unit of analysis would be the national context, meaning political cultural opportunity structures, the conditions for mobilizing success, historical factors, current political development, social crisis, and so on. On the meso level, the social movement is the focus, particularly its specific theoretical traditions and current interpretations of political events. The micro level looks at the individual and analyzes forms of collective identity within a movement as well as individual psychological factors. Given that anti-Semitism is what Sartre termed Weltanschauung and passion. This includes the analysis of authoritarian character structures and emotional involvement. Each of these levels possess different central questions as illustrated in Table 13.1. Of course, these levels are necessarily interlaced. Collective identities are shaped not only by subculture, but also by national culture. Internal movement culture brings with it a distinct history that will influence any given position. Individual identity is shaped not only by the wider society, but, especially in social movements, by the dynamics of belonging to a very specific social milieu. Sorry, interruption from my end. The notion that the specific milieu that you're in and the broader culture you're in being distinct though related things is a very important observation, because I think that a lot of people within the left don't sufficiently distinguish between the two. So problems that are maybe no, I'm sorry, I'm going off the whole fucking thing. Sorry, that's just the very specific social milieu comment kind of struck me. This approach will therefore necessarily remain schematic. For the case study at hand, however, it can aid in explaining the four characteristics of the left anti-Semitism discourse, as mentioned in the, quote, invisible prejudice section above. The occasional appearance of anti-Semitic stereotypes, the one-sided critique and double standard in regard to Israel, anti-Semitism trivialization, and active forms of anti-Semitism denial. She has a chart here, which I think I can read out without it being too awkward. So you have a macro level, and the unit of analysis is the national context. The analytical content is the political, cultural opportunity structures, and the central questions at the macro-national level are, what prevalence does anti-Semitism have in the general society? Which societal actors are addressing anti-Semitism? Societal actors are addressing anti-Semitism. What is their motivation? What politics and attitudes toward Israel are politically dominant? Vis-a-vis the Holocaust, what commemorative culture is in place? At the meso level, we need to talk about the unit of analysis is the social movement, and the analytical content is the theoretical foundations. And the central questions here are, what theoretical traditions form the specific analysis of anti-Semitism, including its origin and explanations? What analytical categories frame current political action? And on the micro level, we have the individual as the unit of analysis, and the content of analysis is identity. And the questions relevant here are, against the backdrop of differing ethnic religious identities, what identitarian needs are fulfilled by not addressing anti-Semitism? What meaning does anti-Zionism have as a, quote, subcultural code? Okay. End of the chart. New section. Anti-Semitism in context, offering explanations. I now turn to the characteristics of the given units of analysis and their content. Macro-level analysis. In the national context, a relative absence of open anti-Semitism in the United States since World War II can be noted, leading to the fact that this is not a subject where the political left sees a particular need for intervention. Since leftists perceive anti-Semitism as simply one among many forms of racism, it becomes invisible compared to racism against blacks and Muslims. By extension, Jews are not perceived as victims, a central category for contemporary claims making. Second, in the United States, one finds generally positive attitudes towards Israel in the general population. According to a survey by the Anti-Defamation League, almost half of Americans were sympathetic to the Israeli side, whereas 18% sympathized with the Palestinians. 63% of all respondents considered Israel an important ally of the United States. Compared to many European countries, the image of Israel in the U.S. media fares better. Whereas, for example, in Germany, popular anti-Israel attitudes provide an opportunity structure for open anti-Semitism, this is less possible in the United States. For leftists, the overall pro-Israel attitude in the general population leads it to a counter-reaction that focuses on the underrepresentation of the Palestinian side and to an ignorance of anti-Semitism as one of the many factors driving the Middle East conflict. Third, the American national context provides a visible commemorative culture with regard to the Holocaust. 80% of Americans support teaching and commemorating the Holocaust. Commemoration ceremonies occur on the federal level. The Holocaust is a fixed part of school curricula, and the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum has had a prominent place on the Washington Mall for over 20 years, receiving 2 million visitors annually. In the left's perception, there exists what one interview partner calls a hierarchy of catastrophe. Holocaust commemoration is seen as happening at the expense of remembering slavery and the genocide of Native Americans. Moreover, Holocaust commemoration is typically understood as solely instrumental in support of U.S. or Israel nationalism. The specific role of the Holocaust plays in the United States leads not only to the invisibility of historical anti-Semitism for the left, but also contributes to instances of its trivialization and, by extension, demonization in critiques of Israel, especially the equation of Israeli policies with Nazism, a trope that can often be found. However, these false equations are not always motivated by anti-Semitism, but more often by intent to scandalize. The fact that Holocaust comparisons are being put into use in U.S. political discourse by actors from different political camps supports this assumption. Former Vice President Al Gore, for example, spoke in environmental campaigns of an ecological crystal night and a, quote, environmental holocaust. The Tea Party has repeatedly made comparisons between the politics of the Nazis and the Democratic Party. Influential right-wing talk show host Glenn Beck often uses similar imagery. And in 2014, Republican Tennessee State Senator Stacey Campfield, on his blog, compared the, quote, Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act with the deportation of Jews during National Socialism. As Guli Ne'eman Arad has pointed out, in the United States, the Holocaust has become a highly popular moral political metaphor, a multi-purpose doctrine easily applicable for different purposes. When applied to Israel, it can further the anti-Semitic imagery of reversing victims and perpetrators, but is not necessarily motivated by an anti-Semitic stance. Another influential factor is the specific context of fighting anti-Semitism in the United States. The topic is usually addressed by organizations such as the Anti-Defamation League and the American Jewish Committee, and often by Jewish individuals who lean more toward the conservative political spectrum. For leftists, this fact often leads to an erroneous automatic association between discussing anti-Semitism and political conservatism. Moreover, since these actors are often the only ones addressing anti-Semitism on the left, but also in Muslim communities or Arab countries, the Livingstone formulation explained above also applies here. Meso-level analysis. At the level of movement culture and its theoretical foundations, correspondence theoretical explanations of anti-Semitism can be found, such as in the Leninist tradition, which see it either as a tool of the ruling class to drive a wedge between workers, or as a direct result of the actions of Israel and Zionist groups in the United States. Because the Israel state and U.S. Zionist groups carry out their politics in the name of global Jewry, for activists, it is supposedly understandable that criticism of Israel or Zionism blends into anti-Jewish sentiment. In left analysis, a critique of Israel therefore becomes the best strategy against global anti-Semitism. Most importantly, anti-racism as a dominant frame and subject in the left also encourages the invisibility of anti-Semitism. Since the time of the abolitionists, anti-racism has been a central paradigm of the U.S. left, continuing through the civil rights movement and becoming foundational for the emergence of the new left. The black-white binary, the color line that W.E.B. Du Bois already theorized in 1903, has remained a central, if not preeminent, category for inequality in the United States. American Jews, however, have undergone a process of whitening in the general perception since the 1950s, as Karen Brodkin has pointed out. They are therefore, in the language of critical whiteness studies, the dominant theory of anti-racism since the 1990s, both in academia and in activism, endowed with white privilege. The Jews are endowed with white privilege, in quotation marks. In the perception of the left, white privilege for U.S. Jews entails social recognition and representation, personal security against attacks due to the possibility of passing, end quotes, economic security, and an exclusive victim status because of the experience of the Holocaust. Therefore, anti-Semitism ranks low compared to other forms of racism. As seen by people on the left, Muslims, on the other hand, have come under increasing threat of racism since 9/11. In the left's perception, there is a competitive dynamic between anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim racism. This priority is made clear in interviews in sentences like, quote, "Today, really, what dominates politics is not anti-Semitism at all, but Islamophobia," end quote. Or, quote, "I haven't felt anti-Semitism is an urgent social justice problem in this country the way that Islamophobia and anti-Muslim oppression is," end quote. Speaking of anti-Semitism supposedly masks the real problem of Islamophobia. Yet at the same time, the frame of anti-racism not only is an enabling condition for anti-Semitic stereotypes, but also hinders it. Open anti-Semitism in the form of Jew hatred rarely happens on the left, and when it does, is usually countered. To return to an earlier example, the person with anti-Jewish banners at Occupy Wall Street was quickly met with protest. People stood next to him with signs stating that, quote, "This guy doesn't speak for me or Occupy Wall Street," end quote. Another asking, quote, "Who's paying this guy?" Or one that simply had an arrow next to the word asshole. The second dominant frame in left discourse is anti-imperialism. Jews, unlike Muslims, are not perceived as victims of imperialist states, but rather are supposedly imperialist states' beneficiaries through their inherent link to Israel. One interview partner critically summarized the perspective on the left, stating, quote, "Jews are the epitome of white imperialism," end quote. In the post-Cold War era, left anti-imperialism targets not only the United States, but also and especially Israel. While not necessarily leading to open anti-Semitism, this attitude has the imminent danger of singling out Jews via the Jewish state. With it comes a binary worldview that cannot see Palestinians as aggressors or actors, but merely as victims or respondents, and will thus not see anti-Semitic ideology as one of many factors influencing the current situation in the Middle East. The anti-imperialist frame also leads to an ignorance of the political content of the conflict parties. The logic of, quote, my enemy's enemy is my friend, end quote, at times causes leftists to endorse reactionary groups like Hamas to justify suicide attacks. This frame has become more prominent since the attack of 9/11. Moshe Pistone speaks of a, quote, neo-anti-imperialism and, quote, a reawakening Manichaeism. End quote. The traditional Marxist-Leninist anti-imperialist worldview is most prominent among socialist groups. Here it goes hand in hand with pitting, quote, bad, that is, Western nationalism, against, quote, good, liberation nationalism. Along with this often comes a, quote, foreshortened, or rather an analytically false critique of capitalism. Critiques characterized by a personified analysis and conspiratorial thinking. This view has been visible within the Occupy Wall Street movement, whose political analysis often targets capitalism not as a systemic organizing principle, but instead narrowly focuses on finance capital and the sole origin of the current crisis and the only aspect of capitalism that needs to be criticized, whereas the sphere of production, which includes Main Street, so to speak, is often seen as devoid of exploitation. This sort of analysis is often a critique of capitalists, not capitalism, and it can be an entry point for anti-Semitism, as Jews have traditionally been associated with this social arena. I mean, I'm guilty of this. Sorry, just a aside. I mean, I'm guilty of not the anti-Semitism part, but definitely viewing a younger version of myself, definitely viewed capitalism, at least partially, through the moralistic lens of critiquing like capitalists as like greedy people, which is not the socially scientific, legitimate way to go about critiquing capitalism. Any hooser. The praise given to Occupy Wall Street by former leading Ku Klux Klan member and Holocaust denier David Duke illustrates this danger dramatically. In a video titled Occupy Zionist Wall Street, Duke congratulates all those who attack the international banks supposedly holding America hostage. In a similar fashion, the American Nazi Party offered its support to Occupy Wall Street, openly praising its potential for making the natives aware of the Jewish Wall Street bankers and stating that, quote, this issue is tailor-made for National Socialists, end quote. Several Nazi groups attempted to infiltrate Occupy encampments but were mostly turned away. However, their praise shows the anti-Semitic potential that can accompany foreshortened and personalistic critiques of capitalism. The less explicitly right-wing actors like the conspiracy theorist David Icke were welcomed with open arms in some Occupy camps. The frame of, quote, American interest is also prominent in left discourse. This perspective analyzes a given domestic or foreign policy issue to determine what the United States' interest in it is. This left logic of taking responsibility for the actions of one's government is certainly not specific to the United States. However, here it can have the unintended effect of rendering anti-Semitism invisible. To give an example, a critique of the dominant historical narratives often results in a critical take on Holocaust commemoration and a demand for more visible remembrance of the victims of the Vietnam War or the genocide of Native Americans. The intention is a heightened attention and visibility for U.S. imperialism and its victims. The unintended result, however, can be an ignorance and even relativization of the Holocaust. The frame of, quote, American interests also partly explains the disproportional engagement with the Middle East conflict. The, quote, double standard of salience, end quote, mentioned in the, quote, invisible prejudice section. Israel is perceived as America's closest ally and the central recipient of U.S. foreign aid. As U.S. citizens and taxpayers, activists feel a special responsibility for criticizing American interest in politics in the region and, by extension, Israel. Micro-level analysis. The third level is that of collective identity. Here specifically, intra-Jewish debates are relevant. For Jewish leftists in the United States, who are often highly represented within progressive movements, debate about Israel and anti-Semitism are also debates about ethnic identity and representation within the Jewish community. Jewish leftists often criticize mainstream Jewish advocacy organizations, their pro-Israel line, and their claims to represent all U.S. Jews. Using a form of strategic essentialism, these secular, non-Jewish Jews speak as Jews to state their case. For many, their positions are related to reclaiming a specific Jewish identity within the American Jewish community, which they feel has been overdetermined via identification with Israel and through large Jewish advocacy organizations. Unlike the mainstream community, whose identity since World War II has rested on the two pillars of the Holocaust and Israel, theirs is also a struggle for an alternative definition of the very meaning of being Jewish in the United States, often resting on the prophetic tradition, on the principle of tikkun olam, and on Jewish involvement in the socialist, communist, and civil rights movements. Reclaiming a progressive Jewish identity therefore means perceiving it as part of the left tradition. This is done in word, but also in deed, through what Alvin Rosenfeld has called new rituals of dissent. Alvin Rosenfeld has called new rituals of dissent. These could most recently be observed in the Occupy movement, which had a clear and visible Jewish presence via a sub-movement called Occupy Judaism. In several cities, Jewish activists initiated public prayers, erecting sukkahs, or celebrating the Shabbat dinner, all the while linking Jewish tradition to the political demands of the Occupy Wall Street movement. All these activities and debates revolve around anti-Semitism as a kind of proxy, whereby Jewish leftists accuse mainstream organizations of muting dissent and perpetuating the image of Jews as eternal victims, fueled by false accusations of anti-Semitism. Whereas anti-Semitism is not intentional in these debates, such debates can be misperceived in the wider society, where they reinforce images of disproportionate Jewish power or of the Israel lobby controlling U.S. politics. However, the fact that many Jews are active and visible in the left also contributes to pluralistic and multifaceted images of Jews who are not overburdened by projection and stereotypes. Finally, on the level of movement identity, we can observe the function of anti-Zionism as a, quote, subcultural code. Almost 25 years ago, Shulamit Volkov applied the concept of anti-Semitism as a cultural code, originally used to analyze the role of anti-Semitism in late 19th century Germany as a political marker, to the contemporary political left. Rejection of Israel has become a distinctive mark of belonging to a specific subcultural milieu. It is part of a comprehensive ideological left, quote, package deal, as Volkov put it. Anti-Zionism is more than a specific position taken toward the Middle East conflict. Rather, it expresses that one is on the right side of history, thereby rejecting imperialism, colonialism, racism, and nationalism. The counter-principle is necessarily Zionism, which allegedly stands for all of these forces. By extension, this attitude impacts the very meaning of anti-Semitism. Jonathan Judican notes that, quote, Antisemitism thus now serves as a proxy for differing positions on the Arab-Israeli conflict, end quote. Focusing analysis on collective identity provides a more accurate explanation for the strong anti-Semitism existing. Focusing analysis on collective identity provides a more accurate explanation of the strong anti-Zionism existing even among Jewish activists when psychologizing in necessarily speculative concepts such as, quote, Jewish self-hatred. Last, the political relevance of these questions should be pointed out. In some instances, it becomes impossible for Jews to talk about anti-Semitism without being accused by the left of trying to push a Zionist agenda. Sometimes Jews are allowed into activist circles only if they accept anti-Zionism and are therefore singled out. In that vein, an article in Revolution, the magazine of the Revolutionary Communist Party, has a suggestion for U.S. Jews. Is Revolutionary Communist Party the one malice group that Robert Bob Avakian was the leader of before he had to flee to France or whatever? Quote, Jewish people, In that vein, an article in Revolution, the magazine of the Revolutionary Communist Party, has a suggestion for U.S. Jews. Jewish people who resent being resented for Israel's crimes, like white people who resent being blamed for white racism and the history of the oppression of black people in this country, need to loudly and unequivocally speak out against Israel's crimes, end quote. The author thereby draws a direct connection between Jewish individuals in the United States and the politics of the Israel state. Moreover, he puts the blame for anti-Semitism on Jews themselves and thus participates in a form of blaming the victim. Ziva, an interview partner from Berkeley, who is the daughter of a Holocaust survivor, comments on this mechanism, quote, I've been very silent. I think most Jews are silent because the left is very strongly pro-Palestine, and people who speak out against that are being accused of being right-wing. And there is no room for it's so emotionally charged. There is no room for dialogue. So I have a different experience among the left. I get really scared because I hear anti-Semitism, and I hear this on demonstrations I won't go to, because I hear so much hatred of Israel, so much hatred of Jews, and I feel like leaving the country. In a way, I feel like I can't be here, end quote. The account of this long-term feminist anti-war activist and dedicated radical, who in her 60s considers leaving both her political movement and country, is a chilling reminder that the aforementioned positions are not just intellectual problems, but can have concrete, deeply negative effects on Jewish individuals. Conclusions. Toward mutual learning processes. To understand anti-Semitism discourse within the contemporary political left, this chapter suggests moving away from a, quote, checklist approach towards anti-Semitism, specifically in relation to critiques of Israel. Instead, it offers a multi-level approach focusing on the enabling conditions of anti-Semitic discourse. In terms of this case study, this means that in the perception of the left, the specific opportunity structures of the United States provide little ground for the spread of anti-Semitism. The relative absence of open anti-Semitism, a general pro-Israel orientation, widespread Holocaust commemoration, and finally the perception that anti-Semitism is only a political issue for the right. Taken together, these factors make anti-Semitism a non-issue in left circles. Anti-Semitism is a, quote, invisible prejudice in the contemporary left in a twofold way. First, its occasional articulation is not generally open and coherent, but takes coded and fragmented forms. Second, it is a prejudice that cannot be seriously addressed. On a subcultural level, there are theoretical traditions, such as Marxist-Leninist analysis of imperialism and capitalism, that can feed into an anti-Semitic worldview. Others, such as the dominance of anti-racist and anti-imperialist political frames, render Jewish positions in the Middle East conflict invisible. These analyses contribute to the various double standards outlined above. On the level of collective identity, one can observe how anti-Zionism functions as a cultural code for most of the left. Moreover, one sees how Jewish identity struggles are an important underlying factor within left debates, which pose the ironic danger of actually reinforcing anti-Semitic stereotypes when transported into the different contexts of the general public. The findings from this case study have both political and theoretical consequences regarding the role of the left in the new anti-Semitism. Wilhelm Kempf noted in an article in the Journal for the Study of Anti-Semitism that, quote, one serious deficiency of anti-Semitism research, however, is that it seldom asks what alternative meanings statements that may express anti-Semitism could also have, end quote. Trying to understand the specific content, the intention behind it, and the possible reception of a given statement gives a better sense of the problem at hand and provides possible starting points for developing strategies for addressing problematic imagery and discourse on the left. While it is necessary to analyze the semantic structures of an anti-Semitic worldview, independent of context, in order for us to understand its global and historical continuities and functions, these insights need to be flexibly applied to different contexts, actors, their intentions, and varied levels of reception. Critiques of Israel or anti-racist positions are only rarely coded forms of expressing anti-Semitism, as some authors have suggested. Rather, they are positions in their own right that provide a possible entry point for genuine anti-Semitic positions. These insights are even more important given the relevance of the topic at hand. Just as the left often responds over hastily to criticism via the Livingstone formulation, sometimes the criticism itself is also overly hasty. Some examples express oversimplified accusations, where the motivation appears less to fight anti-Semitism than to slander a whole movement. Such ad hominem attacks in bad faith happen on both sides. Critics should therefore be thorough in their arguments as well. Why is a certain action or attitude considered anti-Semitic? What are the criteria for making such a determination? Where and why are the lines drawn between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism? David Hirsch's suggestion holds true both for academia and political debates. Quote, sociology should not be content to prove that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitic. Instead, it can help us study distinct forms of anti-Zionism, their particular traditions and assumptions, to look at ways in which they actualize themselves in concrete political exclusions, and to explore the contradictions between the meanings social actors wish to communicate and the meanings with which their communications are heard, read, and interpreted in distinct contexts. End quote. The context is key, and it can be analyzed with the help of the three-level approach suggested above. While it seems unlikely that we are currently witnessing the reemergence of a specifically left anti-Semitism in response to the financial crisis, many factors point to existing enabling conditions for anti-Semitic discourse. While it seems unlikely that we are currently witnessing the reemergence of a specifically left anti-Semitism in response to the financial crisis, many factors point to existing enabling conditions for anti-Semitic discourse. They are theoretical and practical sites of fracture, where anti-Semitism might grow and can be starting points for acceptance of anti-Semitic positions and actors within the left. Rather than either alarmist or appeasing assessments, an analytic approach can give an estimate of the degree of anti-Semitic threat, the historical and contemporary reasons for specific positions, and thus the possibilities for changing the discourse. That this change in discourse is possible is proven by international examples such as the German left, a site of intense internal discussions since the mid-1990s, which has developed a more multifaceted perspective on the Middle East conflict and a stronger sensitization to anti-Semitism, as Peter Ulrich has shown. Shift in discourse is also visible in historical and contemporary attempts at criticizing anti-Semitism within the left. These include the specific attempts of the short-lived Jewish New Left of the 1970s, a loose network of groups, magazines, and individual activists. This offspring of the New Left consisted of Jewish radicals who appropriated the language of the Black Liberation Movement, prominent at the time, in order to promote Zionism as a national liberation movement. Moreover, they battled anti-Semitism within the Black Power movement and other currents of the New Left, all while staying true to their radical left politics. Likewise, debates initiated by Jewish feminists in the second wave of feminism a decade later used the emerging language of identity politics to speak about anti-Semitism. Just as feminists of color had claimed that the victims of racism should be the ones to define what oppression meant to them, so Jewish feminists argued that they needed more visibility as Jews and sought to define the complex nature of anti-Semitism, including the fact that it sometimes expressed itself as anti-Zionism. And finally, some contemporary activists and political groups point to the possibility of changing intra-left discourse. Since 9/11, a handful of publications have come out of the radical left with titles such as, quote, "The past didn't go anywhere, making resistance to anti-Semitism part of all our movements," end quote. And a left-wing blog was established to collect text on anti-Semitism and the left. Meanwhile, selected authors and groups have criticized anti-Semitism in the ultra-globalization movement, within Occupy Wall Street, or in the left in general, or translated articles by German left-wing authors critical of anti-Semitism or anti-Zionism. Activists have occasionally organized workshops and conferences on such topics, including Finding Our Voice, the conference for progressives constructively addressing anti-Semitism, or The World, Capitalist Crisis, Israel, and the Roots of Jew Hatred, or Left Anti-Semitism, Building Bridges to the Right. Judy Andreas, a non-Jewish feminist activist, even organized 2 3-day conferences in 2004 and 2006 on both the East and West Coast titled Facing a Challenge Within, a progressive scholars and activist conference on anti-Semitism and the left with the goal, quote, to strengthen the left by creating a new alternative to the existing polarization that isolates Jews and those who care about Jewish oppression, end quote. Not surprisingly, each of these attempts was met with denial, skepticism, or rejection. These negative responses included emails to the conference organizers, internet comments, protest, angry counter-articles, and a general questioning of the integrity and motivation behind such efforts. Nevertheless, these activities point to a potential that can draw both from history and international experience. Historically, one finds both the danger of anti-Semitism on the left as well as potential for self-criticism and counter-activities, be it through the old left, the Jewish New Left, or lively debates within the feminist movement. Internationally, the German left may provide a useful recent example of a successful learning process. The starting point of that potential gives grounds for hope. Thanks for listening.